Brown versus the Board of Education. Brown versus Topeka Board of Education was a barrier-breaking case taking place in the 1950s. Wanting equality for black children, Oliver Brown took the Board of Education to court in hopes of integrating schools. The Supreme Court's decision to integrate schools triumphed the segregation laws that violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, causing it to be an important point in history for the equality of white people and African Americans. The U.S. wasn't just dealing with racial segregation in the South at this time. We were also at the height of the Cold War, the open yet restricted rivalry that developed after World War II between the United States and their respective allies. The Cold War was waged on political, economic, and propaganda fronts and had only limited resources to weapons. U.S. officials, including Supreme Court justices, were highly aware of the harm that segregation and racism were doing to America's international image. During this time, segregation was the official policy enforced by a series of laws in the South. These laws were known as Jim Crow laws, which was a derogatory term for African Americans. Only 18 states had outlawed segregation in public accommodations at this time. Of the remaining states, 20 still allowed school segregation to take place, 14 still allowed segregation to remain in public transportation, and 30 still enforced laws forbidding miscegenation, which is the interbreeding of two people a part of different races. In this picture, the red highlighted states represents the ones that required segregation. The yellow represents the ones that had no legislation against it. The blue represents the optional or limited segregation in the state, and the green represents the states that forbidded segregation. Legislators segregated everything from residential areas to public parks and theaters. Even pools, cemeteries, asylums, jails, and residential homes were segregated. Signs hung just about everywhere, labeling what was for whites and what was for African Americans. Many parts of the U.S. had racially segregated schools. This was legal because of the Plessy versus Ferguson case in 1896. The verdict of this case was that segregation was legal as long as both facilities were equal to each other. Instead, it provided inferior services, treatment, and accommodations for African Americans. The harsh ways of the U.S. led to many great civil rights movements to come. The case that started it all was the Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education case. This started because one of Oliver Brown's children was denied access to an all-white school. He filed a lawsuit claiming that schools meant for black children were not equal to the white schools. It also stated that it violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Mr. Brown's claim was dismissed by the federal court. The court decided that schools were substantially equal enough to be ruled as constitutional. After Oliver filed a lawsuit against the Topeka Board of Education, the case was put before the district court in Kansas. This court came to the conclusion that segregation had a detrimental effect upon the colored children, but kept the separate but equal doctrine. The case would later be tried again in the Supreme Court along with 4 other cases. The first case to be added to the Brown versus the Board of Education Supreme Court case was the Briggs versus Elliott case. This case took place in Summerton, South Carolina in 1952. South Carolina was one of the 17 states that allowed school segregation. Their law required complete segregation. Article 11, Section 7 of the 1895 Constitution of South Carolina read, "Separate schools shall be provided for children of white and colored races, and no child of either race shall ever be permitted to attend a school provided for children of the other race." Section 5377 of the Code of Laws of South Carolina of 1942 read, "It shall be unlawful for pupils of one race to attend schools provided by boards of trustees for people of another race." At the beginning of the hearings in the U.S. District Court, the defendants admitted upon their record that the educational facilities, equipment, curricular, and opportunities afforded in the school district for colored pupils are not substantially equal to those afforded for white pupils. The case began in 1947 as a request to provide bus transportation. In addition to having separate facilities and inferior facilities, Black children had to walk to school, sometimes many miles. In the neighboring Jordan community, some children walked as many as 16 miles round trip to school each day. In 1952, the Supreme Court heard the case and returned it to the district court for rehearing after Clarendon County school officials sent a report on progress in making facilities equal. Thurgood Marshall argued this may be true, but as long as separation existed, the schools would never be equal. The case was then appealed back to the Supreme Court in May and consolidated with the Brown versus the Topeka Board of Education case. The next case added was the Davis versus County School Board of Prince Edward County case. This came from an all-black high school in Farmville, Virginia called R.R. Moten High School, founded in 1923. This school suffered due to underfunding. The school did not have a gymnasium, cafeteria, or teacher's restroom. Teachers and students did not have the desks or blackboards, and due to overcrowding, some students had to take classes in an immobilized, decrepit school bus parked outside the main school building. The school's request for additional funds were denied by the all-white school board. In response, on April 23, 1951, a 16-year-old student named Barbara Rose Johns secretly organized a student general strike. She forged notes to tell teachers to bring their students to the auditorium for a special announcement. When the school students showed up, Johns took the stage and persuaded the school to strike to protest the poor school conditions. Over 450 students walked out and marched to the homes of members of the school board, who refused to see them. This began a 2-week protest. On May 23, 1951, 2 lawyers from the NAACP, Spotswood Robinson and Oliver Hill, filed a suit on behalf of the students against the school district to integrate schools. The district was represented by T. Justin Moore, Archibald Robertson, and John W. Riley, Williams Gay Powell, and Gibson of a large Virginia law firm company. The state court ruled against the plaintiffs, who appealed the case to the U.S. District Court. The students' request was unanimously rejected by the court. They stated that they had found no hurt or harm to either race. The case was then appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court with the other 2 cases. The third case added to the other 3 cases was the Belton versus Gebhardt case and the Bula versus Gebhardt case. Belton versus Gebhardt was brought by Ethel Louise Belton and 6 other parents of 8 African-American high school students who lived in Claymont, Delaware. Despite the existence of a well-maintained, spacious high school in Claymont, segregation forced the parents to send their children on a public bus to attend the rundown Howard High School in downtown Wilmington. Howard High School was Delaware's sole business and college preparatory school for African-American students and served the entire state of Delaware. Concerns involved class size, teacher qualifications, and curriculum. Howard students interested in vocational training were required to walk several blocks to a nearby annex to attend classes offered only after the end of the normal day. The other case, Bulla versus Gebhardt, was brought by Sarah Bulla, a resident of the rural town of Hockessin, Delaware. Miss Bulla's daughter, Shirley, had been denied admission to the modern whites-only Hockessin school and was instead compelled to attend a one-room colored Hockessin school, though the school had inferior facilities and construction. Moreover, Shirley Bulla was required to walk to school every day, even though a school bus serving the nearby whites-only school passed her house. Miss Bulla had attempted to obtain transportation for Shirley on that bus, but she was told they would never transport an African-American. In 1941, a group of parents from the Anacostia neighborhood of Washington, D.C., calling themselves the Consolidated Parents Group, petitioned the Board of Education of the District of Columbia to open the nearly completed John Philip Sousa Junior High as an integrated school. The school board denied the petition, and the school opened, admitting only whites. On September 11, 1950, Gardner Bishop, Nicholas Stable, and the Consolidated Parents Group attempted to get 11 African-American students admitted to the school, but were refused entry by the school's principal, James Nabbit, Jr., a professor of law at Howard School of Law, a historically black university, filed suit on behalf of Bowling and the other students in the district court for the District of Columbia, seeking assistance in the students' admission. When the court dismissed the claim, the case was granted a writ of certiorari by the Supreme Court. While Nabbitt's argument in Bowling rested on the unconstitutionality of segregation, the much more famous Brown v. Board of Education, decided on the same day, argued that the idea of separate but equal facilities sanctioned by Plessy v. Ferguson of 1896 was a fallacy, as the facilities for black students were woefully inadequate. When all 5 cases were brought to the Supreme Court, the justices were divided on how to rule the segregation. On May 17, 1954, a verdict was finally reached. The court decided that people of color were of equal protection laws as stated by the 14th Amendment. Warren wrote that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. The court's verdict did not exactly specify how the school should be integrated. The court's intention with their verdict was good-willed. It caused local judicial and political evasion of desegregation. Some states, including Kansas, followed the verdict. Many others in the South defied it. One example of this was in Little Rock, 1975. Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas called the state National Guard to stop black students from attending high school, more commonly known as the Little Rock Nine. Sadly, the verdict of this trial didn't end school segregation on its own, but it sparked many more civil rights movements to help end segregation in America. It is described as one of the most greatest accomplishments in U.S. history.